Hello and welcome again to the video summary for What is a Human? This is week 10. I'm Dr. Chris Fleming, and this week we're looking at religion. Now, religion is important to have a look at. Sometimes it's been argued by a number of people that religion is one of these human constants, or what we call a human universal. That is, there are no human cultures, as far as we're aware of, that are totally devoid of religion, or at least religious elements. I'll say maybe something more about this in a moment. But and it's also true that if you go back deeply into the historical record, the first artifacts, the first signs of human culture we have, human culture at this stage is religious in its very structure. Now, even secular cultures these days, you might argue, and there's a certain school of French anthropology that argues this, following from Marcel Mauss and Emile Durkheim, that even supposedly secular societies have religious elements. That is, they have founding myths, they have rituals, and so on. In any case, we're not going to dwell there at this stage. What I want to do is recap three parts. Well, the first two parts of Girard's theory, so we can wind up in the third and final part of Girardian thought, which will shed some light, hopefully, on this week's topic, and we'll be leaving Girard behind. In fact, we're leaving Girard behind this week because some of this work was not done by him. It was done by later theorists. If you want to have a look at that and the references there, look at the PowerPoint for this week. Okay, so in the first phase of work, you have the early work of Girard, which is really literary criticism, to seek desire in the novel. But essentially what Girard is arguing there is the human is an imitator, or what we later learned as the Homo imitans, human as imitator. And human beings, Girard contends, not only copy each other's social behaviours and so on, we imitate each other's desires. Now that's fine in certain circumstances, but under other circumstances, this kind of imitation of desire can lead us into forms of rivalry and social unrest. Now, if that rivalry itself can spread and destabilise either small social groups, or at its worst, societies more generally. Now, what happens when this kind of breakdown of social order occurs, and we move to the second phase of Girard's work in works like Violence and the Sacred, is that at a certain point a victim or group of victims, a group, will present themselves. That is, they will not present themselves literally, but they will be noticed and will be blamed for the crisis. And they, what we normally call in English, a scapegoat. And so people are scapegoated for causing these kinds of crises, and they are excluded, they are banished, or in some cases killed. And what happens is that this banishment ends up producing a kind of social unanimity in the group. The group binds strongly together because of their exclusion and scapegoating of a marginal group. Now, this is, of course, only a temporary solution, and soon social unrest can set in again, and people need to find new scapegoats. Now, there's a third phase in Girard's work, and this is what you might call, put under the heading of anti-myth. Now, what do I mean, anti-myth? Well, if you look at certain classical myths, you'll see that there are a number of motifs that occur. This is the same as human rituals. What am I talking about? Well, if you go through the the Encyclopedia of Human Myth, you'll find an enormous number of instances of, say, warring brothers. Now, this is you're talking about kind of Horus and Set in Egypt, Romulus and Remus in Roman myth, Thor and Loki. There's probably, this in Norse myth, at least we understand this through Marvel now. But you have this kind of human universal. Other things that appear in myth are this kind of general disorder, and order of the world comes out of this disorder. And the most universal form, or the most widespread form of religious ritual is, in fact, sacrifice. Now, why am I relating all this? Well, Girard argues that these kinds of features of culture, these myths of warring brothers and the ritual of sacrifice, really represent a restaging of the crisis and resolution of, mimetic crisis and surrogate victimage. Why would this be the case? Well, in the stage of mimetic crisis, what you have is a kind of doubling of antagonists. Antagonists end up looking more and more like each other. And the way this often gets coded in mythology is with enemy friends, enemy twins, or doubles. Right? And what happens? Well, you have eventually a kind of sacrifice, someone gets killed at the result or excluded, and that, Girard says, gets retranslated into ritual sacrifice. Now, Girard says, early on when Girard was writing this, he was considered to be an atheistic thinker, because this is a pretty negative view of religion, right? So basically what Girard was arguing at this point is religion is really just a coded form that justifies mimetic violence and scapegoating. Now, Girard said it's not quite that simple, because for a few reasons, but I'm going to centre on one. He said, well, there are a number of religious traditions that in fact don't do this. They have the same kind of elements as these other kind of mythological themes and rituals, but they have a very, very different editorial stance. What am I talking about? Well, in a lot of these myths, and take, say, Romulus and Remus as an example, the brothers get into a fight. Romulus kills Remus, and this is a good thing. According to the myth, this was what the omens predicted. This is all fine, and the founding of Rome occurs. Now, Girard says, if you notice that there is a tradition, and he says it starts in the Old Testament, in the Bible, that you have warring brothers, but rather than the killing, these kind of killings and these violence presented as being necessary or good, in fact, they are presented as being horrible. So when Cain, you have Cain and Abel as the warring brothers, and when Cain kills Abel, God condemns Cain for this. Right? So the myths look the same, but the editorial perspective is different. That is, Girard says that in the Abrahamic tradition, and by that I mean Judaism, Christianity, and then Islam, that the stories are narrated from the perspective of the victims of violence, not the perpetrators of violence. Now, you get this in a whole series of texts. Cain and Abel's obviously one. The non-sacrifice of either Ishmael in the Islamic tradition or Isaac in the Christian Jewish tradition. You have Joseph and his brothers and so on. Now, these are all examples of, you might say, anti-myths. So that is, they have the look of mythological tales, but what's different about them is they're told from the perspective of the victim. They're told from the perspective of Joseph, for instance, Joseph and his brothers, who is persecuted by his brothers. And the persecution is not made to look good, as it often is in standard mythology. And so what Girard says is that there are these Abrahamic traditions that deconstruct violence for us. Now, this is an enormously complicated thing for a variety of reasons. One is we need to ask the question, well, why have these religions been so violent if this is the case? Right? That's one important question. The other question is, are these the only ones? Is it only in the Abrahamic traditions that these kinds of unveilings occur? And again, you need to read more about this and open up this area. These things get very, very complex very, very quickly. But in short, what you might say in answer to the first is, well, if you end up deconstructing or demythologizing violence, then people need to do more of it in order to get the same effect. If you start to see your own scapegoating, what happens is humans don't scapegoat less, they scapegoat more. Because as the scapegoat mechanism fails, as we no longer believe in scapegoating people as much anymore, we need to do it more and more to get the same effect. It's a bit like antibiotics in that way. Now, Girard has argued, and other theorists have argued, that there are traditions outside of the Abrahamic traditions that do these kind of unveilings. Girard finished, very close to his death, he finished a series of lectures at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris about Vedanta in Hinduism. He said there is a very strong anti-sacrificial and anti-violent impulse within strands of Hinduism as well. Anyway, so now, just two more things that we need to go through. One is, well, what does violence look like in modern society then? Because it's not, mythical violence in terms of we don't sacrifice chickens, and these kinds of violence doesn't have this kind of feature largely in the West for most of us. Now, one of the things that one way you might put it is that modern violence it's very easy to flare up, but it's also very easy to put out. What do I mean by that? Well, last weekend there was probably 1,000 pub fights or more in Sydney, and it was quite easy to start them. They happen in most pubs, or a large majority probably. I don't know, I haven't been to a pub at 3 in the morning for a very long time, but that's usually, I remember, when things like this happen. But again, it doesn't involve the whole pub. Now, there are kind of cultures, certain tribal cultures, where violence breaks out. It's much harder for violence to break out, but once it does, everyone gets involved because of the very strong kinship ties between people. So in tribal cultures, it's rarer for violence to break out, but it can be potentially more catastrophic in terms of the involvement of the community. Look, so there are a whole series of complex issues that arise here, and I can't pretend that we need to go through all of them, that we'll be able to go through all of them in a matter of 10 or 15 minutes. Now, what we ended the lecture with were some questions to do with this Girardian thought generally. Is it the case that you need to be religious in order to believe Girard? Do you need to be a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew in order to accept this idea? Or can you say, oh, look, I understand what he's saying about these traditions and I agree with him. I don't believe the metaphysics, but I see what he says about these as different kinds of myths, maybe. So that's the first question. Do you need to be religious in order to see Girard's point here? The second thing is to do with, well, what do we do now? If this is what happens, if you look at mimetic rivalry and violence as catchy and so on, what do we do about it? Because there's at a very trite level, you could say, well, everybody should just be peaceful, man. Everyone should be, don't reciprocate violence. We should not be violent to each other. Now, that doesn't seem to be a particularly adequate approach in some ways, ethically at least, because non-violence is maybe an effective strategy for yourself, but to be non-violent on behalf of other people, if someone comes up and attacks the person that's walking down the street with you, is it okay for you to just go, oh, well, you can hit them again because, I'm non-violent? Or do you have an obligation to respond? And if you do respond, what can that produce? So there are questions about human violence that need to be addressed here. If we accept at least part of what's going on here is this group scapegoating violence and exclusion, what do we do as a result? And that is really the topic for week 11. Now, one final thing. I realise that this week, of all the weeks, has been the most packed in terms of material and the most complicated. And it's impossible to avoid when you're looking at comparative religion, you're looking at the anthropology of society and cultures, when you're looking at modern political theory, things get very complex very quickly. But if you just stick, you'll see that in the readings that you can simplify things any number of ways. Now, and so the other important thing is ask your tutor. If things this week looked a bit fuzzy to you, ask them to bring it back right to the most simple level. And we should be able to work from there. But in any case, look, I'm going to leave it there and hope you're well. And we'll see you in week 11.